Okay, so on to adolescence. Okay, so adol- adolescence goes through a lot more changes, of course. They're not always as dramatic as, say, during childhood. They're sometimes a little more subtle. Um, of course, the biggest change is going through puberty, right? The onset of physical and sexual maturity. And what's interesting is that puberty actually has quite a range. So happen between 8 and 14 years, and it also takes between 3 and 4 years. As we'll get to in a second, depending on whether you're go through puberty earlier versus later, typically has different effects. Girls typically do start earlier than boys. And one other interesting thing is, girls start earlier than boys, and it's about 2 to 3 years on average. And also, there does seem to be some sort of secular trend going on. Puberty, more recently, is starting earlier than it did years ago. So, as they're going through puberty at a younger age. And the cause is not totally certain, though it might be due to diet and obesity. So obesity does seem to be related to effects on puberty happening earlier. Okay, so let's talk about the timing. If girls go through puberty earlier, it typically has some negative effects on them. So they'll have lower self-esteem, they can have depression, poor body image, and be very self-conscious of themselves, right? So you could probably imagine that being the case where you're a girl and you're changing kind of physically and mentally more before everyone else is. You could imagine how that would make you fairly self-conscious and feel kind of different from other people. So yeah, early puberty is associated with negative things with girls. With boys, it is associated with problems, but different problems. It's not so much that they feel bad about themselves. In fact, they actually, I think if anything, feel good about themselves, but it's still associated with issues of aggression and issues of law, like breaking the law and committing crimes. So you can imagine how if someone, if a boy goes through puberty much earlier than others, they're going to be bigger, stronger, more manly than everyone else. And I mean, this could lead to issues like them bullying others, kind of thinking they're more powerful or more, kind of thinking they're tougher than other people, trying to prove that, stuff like that, right? On the other hand, boys, when it's late, when puberty happens later, is also associated with issues. So they typically will be anxious and feel depressed. So if everyone else has kind of started growing, and gone through puberty, become more manly, you can imagine where if you're kind of left behind and you still haven't done this yet, that's going to make you feel anxious and somewhat depressed. It's of course not always the case, but it's more likely if puberty goes on late. Of course, with girls who go through later puberty don't tend to have any issues really. Early is also associated with increased sexual activity and teen pregnancy. So obviously if you're, starting to feel a sense of attraction to other people, but you don't really have kind of the mental capacity for a mature relationship or to kind of plan things out and think about consequences of, unprotected sex or whatever, this could obviously lead to teen pregnancy. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is that as you continue, so remember we talked before about how in childhood, a lot of the kind of neurons and neural cells are basically there and ready to go. But the development is still drawing a lot of connections. And also keep in mind that pruning is still going to happen. So if you don't kind of work on things or kind of use certain abilities, they don't really develop because they prune off and kind of die. But another interesting finding when it comes to adolescent development is that your brain doesn't exactly develop evenly. So not all things are going to go in the same order. And in fact, this might be why, or evidence seems to suggest this is why teens will often do kind of reckless and not well thought out things. So myelination, remember when you have your axon, it's going to be insulated with myelin, and this helps you conduct neural signals. So electrically, right? Well, this is going to be a big process. It's going to kind of keep happening for quite a while. In fact, up until you're about 25. The thing is that it happens from the back to the front, right? And if you remember, the limbic system is kind of a little bit more towards your back, and the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, that's all going to be in the front. So the bottom line is that as a result, the areas that are responsible for emotion, aka being the limbic system, right, are going to be developing earlier than the areas responsible for self-control, for planning, stuff like that, right, being the prefrontal cortex. So as a result, your emotional responses are developing earlier than your logical responses, okay? Your frontal lobe keeps going, your frontal lobe and your prefrontal cortex are going to keep developing all the way up till 25, right? But the limbic system, your emotional stuff, happens well before that. So you can kind of imagine where an adolescent might have a really well-developed emotional system, so they react emotionally, they do impulsive things, they get upset, whatever it might be, but their frontal lobe and their prefrontal cortex are not really fully developed to kind of calm them down, make them, restrain themselves, kind of stop themselves from doing reckless things, plan ahead, stuff like that, right? Okay. Another big thing that happens in adolescence is egocentrism. So remember, we talked about egocentrism, of course, with children, but here it's a little bit different. So with children, remember, they just can't really tell the difference between, or you don't even know that there's a difference between what they know and what you know. So they think if you could see something, they can see it. Or sorry, if they can see something, you can see it, right? Well, this doesn't exactly go away in adolescence. In fact, this is here. Some degree of egocentrism is basically present forever. No, we don't really have time to talk about that, though. But anyways, so although they understand that other people's knowledge is different from theirs, they do kind of overemphasize what they know and kind of forget, or what's noticeable to them, over what's maybe obvious to others, right? So they get this feeling like there's kind of a spotlight on them. So they think that, if they, wore kind of an outfit that wasn't, very, very good looking, or say they spilled something on their shirt or whatever, they do think that because it's obvious to them and they're conscious of it, everyone else is perfectly aware of it and cares a whole lot about it, right? So they kind of feel like there's the spotlight on them, where something they did that might be embarrassing or that they're self-conscious of is way more obvious and noticeable to other people than it actually is, right? That's how egocentrism still plays a role in adolescence. And I think kind of throughout your whole life to a certain degree, especially during adolescence. Another thing that happens in adolescence is this idea of a personal fable, okay? And this is the feeling like thoughts, feelings, and experiences are more unique to them than they are to other people, right? So, for example, a child might, or an adolescent might feel like no one else really understands what it's like to play football and try to be an A student at the same time, right? They think that no one else has had someone they were in love with or really attracted to at that age, right? They kind of, I guess you could say, are self-absorbed because they feel like things, thoughts, feelings, and experiences are really unique to them and not so much to everyone else, right? No one's kind of experienced what they've experienced. That's what we mean by personal fable. They also tend to be reckless, and they kind of have this invincibility fable. They feel like they can't be harmed by anything that would harm a normal person. Although this is a little more complicated than that. It's not just that they feel like they won't get hurt from something, but they often just ignore it. So it's a little bit unclear. But bottom line is they do kind of not take threats or possible harms as seriously as they should. Okay? Another big thing in adolescence is that adolescents tend to use intuitive thought rather than analytical thought. So what we mean by intuitive thought is just kind of going with whatever the kind of gut feeling or seemingly obvious answer is, right? So rather than kind of break things down in terms of, really what logically might be the answer or might be the truth, they tend to go with their gut feeling, right? And as we know, our gut feelings can be misleading. So let's do an exercise to demonstrate that. Okay, Timothy is good looking, strong, and does not smoke. He has lots of friends. He loves sports. He enjoys driving his Mustang convertible. He's in good shape and is concerned with his looks. He is a senior now and trying to get a college scholarship. Based on this description, rank these statements in terms of how likely it is should say each are to be true. Okay. So take a second to do that. Okay. So a lot of people, a lot of people in general, but especially adolescents, will say that Timothy is popular and is an athlete. Is the most likely, and they'll usually say Timothy is a teacher's pet and has a girlfriend is also likely. But those two things are actually not likely compared to the other options. Let me tell you why. This is something known as the conjunction fallacy. It's unfortunately not something we get into. Unfortunately, we can't really go into the logical fallacies, which are really fun, too much, but just think about it for a second. So what is more likely, that you are A and B, or that you are just A or just B, right? The answer is that it's more likely you're just one thing, right? Because having a girlfriend and being a teacher's pet is always going to be less likely than just having a girlfriend or just being a teacher's pet, right? You can still, if you have a girlfriend, you can still be a teacher's pet or not. So basically all the people, let me put this differently, who have a girlfriend are going to be, all the people who are teacher's pets and have a girlfriend is going to be a subset of the people who just have a girlfriend, right? All the people who are popular and are athletes is still going to be less than the amount of people who are just athletes or are just popular. Okay? Think of it as a Venn diagram, right? So, anyways, this relies on something known as the representative heuristic, where people pick things as probable that seem representative, and it's kind of another gut intuition that can lead us astray. So anyway, so people don't think this logically. They often just pick what seems likely to them based on their intuition, which is based on the representative heuristic. You don't have to know the representative heuristic, but just know that it's an example of kind of a gut feeling that they would rely on instead of being more rational. So back to adolescence, this is why they typically choose this. One of the two option ones, even though it's less likely. So adolescents in particular like to rely on their gut feeling, their intuitive thought, rather than more slower analytical thought. And they're subject to a lot of logical fallacies, like I said. So something like base rate neglect, so just kind of forgetting. Base rate neglect is kind of the same idea as this, where, okay, again, there's more athletes than there are people who are popular and are athletes, right? Sunk cost fallacy is another one. This is the tendency for you to kind of basically keep throwing money over something, even though you should quit. But don't worry about that too much. Bottom line is that adolescents tend to rely on intuitive thought more than analytic thought, and it leaves them open to a bunch of logical fallacies. They'll also tend to follow impulses to gain social approval. Okay. So another big change that happens in adolescence is conceptions of morality and moral thinking. So the earlier stage is this idea that happens fairly, I think, before adolescence, is this idea of pre-conventional morality. And in this stage, you just think of things in terms of self-interest, rewards, and punishment, right? So if you're, if the only reason you care about, say, following the rules is because you could get busted and, get grounded, get sent to the principal's office, get kicked out of school, whatever, this is pre-conventional morality. So you're only interested in following the rules because of rewards and punishment, right? You don't want to get fired or get grounded or whatever. You only want to behave nicely because of the rewards, right? The next stage is actual conventional morality. So this is being more concerned with what other people actually think of you. So for example, you could still argue that this is to some degree a self-interest issue, but it at least kind of builds upon that by caring what other people think. So maybe you don't want to steal something because you don't want other people to think you're a thief, right? You don't want to cheat on the test because you're worried of kind of what the social norm is of other classmates be okay with that, right? Then the last one that kind of happens is this idea of post-conventional morality. And this is going to kind of come around in late adolescence. So this is the idea that you really start to think about things in terms of actual ethical principles and rights and stuff like that, right? So you're no longer just about, okay, this is the norm, this is what people do, but you kind of feel like, well, you feel a more kind of logical sense of morality of, okay, people have certain rights to the property to kind of, govern themselves or make their own decisions, stuff like that, right? That's all coming from the post-conventional morality stage. The idea that people have rights and there's kind of certain ethics and principles that people have. Okay, so moving on, of course, to social development. This is also where you get a lot of change in adolescence. So early on in infancy, you kind of deal with a lot of things just in terms of trust, mistrust. So if someone is kind of reliable and they, particularly a parent, provide for you and give you attention and stuff like that, you tend to be trusting of other people in general. Moving on to toddlerhood, this is when you kind of want to start doing things for yourself to a certain degree. So you feel a sense of autonomy, or else you feel a kind of a sense of shame and doubt. So if you can't do anything for yourself, even as a toddler, you feel a sense of shame. When you get into preschool, you also kind of have a sense of initiative versus guilt, meaning you kind of want to apply yourself and kind of start things on your own rather than just be kind of told to do them or, forced to do them in some way. When it gets to elementary school, you have this sense of or desire for kind of competence, right? So you really want to be able to successfully do certain things, or you feel a sense of inferiority. So on to adolescence, this is where a big aspect of social development happens. You develop a sense of identity, or you develop a sense of role confusion. So this is where what you essentially do is you kind of test out or try different roles, right? So you might have a few different friends and you kind of try with some being the guy who likes sports, or maybe with others, you're the guy who likes to, watch TV or play games or whatever it might be, right? So, or you have another crowd where it's all about, I don't know, debating things, right? And this is kind of what happens during adolescence. You're testing out different identities and trying to see what identity do I like and where do I want to fit in, right? Who am I as a person? And if this doesn't kind of proceed correctly, you end up with this role confusion where you're not really sure what your identity should be or what you want it to be. Just while we're on the subject, the other ones are intimacy versus isolation. So kind of in young adulthood, you have struggled to kind of find close relationships. It could be romantic or otherwise, but there's a definite craving for that. Otherwise, you feel a sense of isolation. During middle adulthood, you have this idea of generativity versus stagnation. So this is the sense as though you kind of want to contribute something to society. You want to feel like I'm accomplishing something and I'm giving something to the world. Not so much giving, but contributing, right? Then in late adulthood, you kind of reflect on whether you're satisfied or not with what you've done in your life. Okay, so back to this idea of identity and role confusion. When you finally achieve your identity and you kind of feel like you know who you are, this is called identity achievement. On the other hand, if you don't really know or care what your identity is, this is known as role confusion. Okay? If you have identity foreclosure, this means that you kind of have a premature identity formation. So maybe you tried something and you kind of went along with it in terms of an identity, but it was never really the right one for you. And you kind of chose one before testing out all the options, right? Lastly, you have an identity moratorium where you kind of postpone making identity achievement decisions. And this is somewhat normal. So you're kind of, taking your time to figure out who you might be. And again, this is kind of a lot of different things, right? It's not just, I talked a little bit about it in terms of social nature, like what crowds do you hang out with, but it's everything, right? So it's, what kind of person am I? Do I want to have a family? What kind of job do I want? Do I want to go to school? Do I want to be a good student? Basically everything, right? What are my hobbies? All kinds of things contribute to your identity, right? Social parts are definitely important, but not all of it. When we do talk about social identity, that's what we mean by, specifically kind of what groups do you belong, right? So you might be still figuring out what your career identity might be. What do you want to do for a living? What do you want to contribute to society? But social identity is more specific to, what kind of people are you going to surround yourself with, right? And there's some overlap there, but there's kind of also some separation. Another thing that happens during adolescence is that typically people pull away from their parents a little bit and are more engaged with their peers, right? So spend a little less time with parents, but more so with peers. And of course, you have kind of a selection effect where you're going to seek out peers with similar interests and attitudes. So although you do kind of move away from your parents a little bit, you typically find that more positive peer relationships are associated with more positive parent-teen relationships. So if you're doing kind of get along well with your parents, and, still like each other, um, that's going to predict positive peer relationships, right? Mind you, the directionality on this is not really clear, so it could certainly be the case that, you know, if you get along well with your parents, this somehow means you can easily get along with others. Maybe you've kind of developed a skill, or it could be that maybe if you don't get along well with your peers, this causes you to fight with your parents more, right? In general, positive parent relationships are kind of associated with a lot of different good things, positive things, but it's not entirely clear what the direction is. So if you have, say, a drug problem or an alcohol problem, I mean, that could be an effect or a cause of parent relationships, right? Or your relation to your parents. Okay.